Ben Teitelbaum, thank you so much for joining me again on the Real Clear Values podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Tom.
Ben, I am fascinated by your work, and your work has ever increasing salience with what is sadly, tragically happening in Ukraine at the moment, and the people behind the influences that are behind Vladimir Putin's actions in there. So I'm really interested to talk to you about that, but I'm also interested to talk to you about your work that you do in relation to nationalism and the influence that nationalism has, the appeal that nationalism has. And I want to go back to the beginning of your story, so to speak, about growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, as a teenager, seeking this identity, this Swedish identity that comes from your family roots. Tell us about that. Tell us what it was like to grow up in suburban Denver for you, and how that contributed to your yearning to be Swedish.
Well, have you ever been to Denver, Tom?
Yes, I have, and I've only been through the airport though. So I've got a sister who lives in Denver, who lives near Denver now, but I haven't visited her since the pandemic, since she moved. And I've got a very good friend and mentor who lives in Colorado Springs. So I've been through the airport many times, but yeah, mainly Colorado Springs for me.
Well, there's something. If anyone has ever been to like the Front Range of Colorado, there's this weird contrast that was very much the backdrop of my upbringing. You have this dramatic, almost otherworldly landscape that just arrests your attention as you're driving around, especially the western parts of Denver. And I grew up just into the mountains west of Denver, but you see the after effects of really violent earthquakes. There are dinosaur fossils and footprints. On parts of these kind of hogback ridges that flank that really frame Denver to the west. So you see nature imposing itself on you in this area, and yet the suburban Denver seems to take no notice of it whatsoever. And it's very strange almost to walk in these cookie cutter American suburban neighborhoods that are really abut the start of the Rocky Mountains, and to just see that there's no sign of it. There's no trace of this environment in the human culture there. It's cookie cutter. It's people, if they want to have lawns, most people do have lawns. They go through all these hoops to make sure that they create this artificial environment right there. So that has something to do with just the geography, even the human geography there. But at a deeper level, you're living in a society in a place like Colorado, which, especially as like a white Colorado, middle class white Colorado society, where you have almost no connection to the people around you, save from that fact that it's a predominantly white and relatively well-to-do part of the United States. What unites you and your neighbors in most cases is mutual enthusiasm for a particular standard of living. That's it. We happen to speak the same language in most cases, but we don't know each other. We don't know anything about the place we live on. We know so little about the history of it. So you end up, in other words, to put a bow on all that, the experience for me then, and it still is kind of the experience now, is one of an identitylessness. That you're in a place without context. You're in a place where you can't really say that you have any claim to local identity, to the soil. You don't have any particular knowledge even compared to, like, if I meet a Swede, an average Swede knows quite a bit about the natural world that they're living in, knows what plant, how to forage, knows, can identify. Coloradans know very, very little of that. So you're kind of
Wow.
out of context there. And I think that was part of the reason, that Colorado aspect of it was part of the reason why growing up I felt like, like, do I belong any place? Is there any place in this world that is particularly mine, that I have any particular claim to? Is there anything distinct about me? And does anyone care here even? Because no one seems to care. Um,
Mm,
so
mm.
so those sorts of questions were there from a pretty young age when I was growing up.
Yeah. So those are very existential questions, and I think about this in relation to something to the work of Nietzsche, who has been covered quite a lot on this podcast fairly recently, and this idea of borderlessness, borderless horizons, so to speak,
Mhm.
and not,
Formless.
yeah, exactly, and not having a sense of who you are. And he talked about that in relation to the death of God. I do actually know what you mean about America more broadly in that context, because people have obviously settled there, and man has superimposed himself onto the environment. So, like you say, if people want lawns, it's fairly artificial, because it's like people have arrived here, they've set up shop, and they're going to make the environment work for them in the way that they want to live their lives and set up. And so the roots in terms of the environmental roots, or the connection to the environment, aren't as deep as, like you say, with what it would be somewhere else, like in Sweden or Swedish culture, where they know the land, they know the soil very well, they know the seasons very well as well, and they work with nature as opposed to perhaps superimposing themselves onto nature.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you can even just look at a map. You just take the UK or any, I mean, look at the map of Colorado. It's a giant artificial square, just straight lines just drawn through a vast expanse with no consideration for what is taking place on the ground, either in a natural or a cultural sense. It's just an empty void. And there are great things about that. There are other, one could speak of, and I know even there's some social scientists who speak of a sort of Rocky Mountain frontier spirit of possibility, of openness, and of the future.
Mm,
And the solution, I think, from the liberal democratic mindset for someone like me, let's say someone who feels disassociated from people around them and from their places, well, you cannot find unity and community with people in your past and in history, but you can create a common future with those around you. And
mm,
so look for that commonality, that sense of communitas in the future instead of in the past.
yeah.
Yeah, and my response, to that is okay. Is a sort of hesitating. I get it. I get that we have to do that, because the opposite is sort of impossible slash dangerous. But there's a little something missing. If nothing else, I would like to mourn. I would like to have the right to mourn the loss of something. And in that
Yeah.
sense, I suppose I'm somewhat falling into the mold of a typical modern nostalgic in that sense. But
Mm.
it feels very personal, at least.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because now that I think about Denver, and the little I do know about my own experience of being in Denver, I always see and I always laugh at that big, kind of ugly looking Bronco thing that's by the airport. And I just always ask my friend, what on earth is that doing there? It just looks like it's such an eyesore. But it's almost like it's some attempt at symbology, isn't it? That it's like an attempted identity of, this is Colorado. This is it's the Bronco. The Bronco is for Colorado. This is what we've got to say of our identity and our symbolism.
Absolutely, I like an attempt, and it's an attempt at barbarism. It's an attempt at passion as opposed to reason. That we might be a community of passion as opposed to just a transactional utilitarian collective. Yes, although a lot of people hate that Bronco. So,
Well, it always
um,
makes me laugh. So
yes,
I think it's the eyes, the quite
they're
sinister
terrifying.
looking eyes. So
Yes, yes,
not
they really
not
are.
very
They really
welcoming.
are.
But
No, no, it's not like the Chamber of Commerce, their dream for a way to kind of encourage tourism and investment in Denver. It's a frightening, fierce looking crest for the city.
yeah, absolutely. So tell us about Sweden then, Ben, and your connection with Sweden, and how your yearning for Sweden really kicked in when you felt this sort of, I don't want to say it was an existential crisis, but maybe an existential malaise in Colorado growing up.
Yeah, so my family, my father's family is Jewish, my mother's family is Swedish, for reasons that aren't super clear to me, but probably have something to do with the fact that being Jewish means that you're part of a sort of ethno-religious minority that is also subjugated, marginalized. I that wasn't where I wanted to go to find a sense of belonging. It's something that I'm ashamed of. I'm very interested in my Jewish background too. But at that time, um, I almost overnight became obsessed with studying my Swedish roots, with learning to speak Swedish. I was a musician, and as quickly as I could, I started playing Swedish folk music and learned to play a Swedish folk instrument, nyckelharpa, which ended up being a big part of my younger life. and started traveling to Sweden to find Swedish relatives, doing a lot of genealogical research, and this was all really when I was in like middle school and high school. So it was a very odd thing to be doing at that age. There's a film, Everything is Illuminated, actually about a Jewish American seeking his roots in Ukraine, in Jewish Ukraine. And when I saw that movie later on, I really identified with it. It was a very odd young man who just seemed to have a deep, almost irrational interest in charting and studying, obsessing about his ancestors, and that was something that I started to
Mm,
do as
mm.
well.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned the word irrational, because this is a conflict that I feel that we're coming up against. We're butting up against this very, very clearly. Like you talk about the liberal democratic ideals of, let's make money together, or let's be a community together so we can make money and live in comfort on the one
Yes.
hand, and we're supposed to be satisfied with that. That's supposed to be enough. And if we have enough money, then we're supposed to behave very, very nicely, very well, and get along with each other without any conflict or any difference whatsoever. And
Yes.
that's kind of, I know I'm painting with a very broad stroke there, but broadly speaking, that's it, isn't it? Money's supposed to be the answer.
If it constant economic advancement is supposed to cover up, right, all of our more irrational base yearnings, if all of our tribalisms, whether they're expressed in terms of ethnic identity, nationalism, religion, and things like that. If so long as we improve our material state, we should be able to get past those lower, less developed aspects of ourselves. That is, I think, what is sold to us. I don't know that I needed
Mm,
money when I was a teenager, for example,
mm,
um, and I've often wondered how that theory is supposed to deal with uh, wayward youth in a way.
yeah.
I'm sure there's a social theorist who's thought about it, but what I don't think. I wasn't poor growing up by any means. I don't think even more money would have solved this for me, or living in an environment that was even more developed and having more access to leisure and recreation and things like that. I don't think would have helped. So, um, uh, yeah, that leaves me wondering too. Maybe that's something that as an adult,
Mm.
you could wash away your other yearnings.
Yeah, that's interesting. It almost seems to me like it's a numbing, though. It doesn't seem like it's a satisfying. It's more of a numbing. It's more of a suppression than anything else. I don't think it's fulfilling to do that. I don't feel a sense of. I think about my own life and my own achievements. If I achieve something in my working life, for example, I care more about the thing itself that I've done and accomplished rather than the bonus or the paycheck that I get, which is great. And by all means,
Which is very
I'll take
rare,
it. What's
right?
that say?
Right, which is very rare, though. I think as well, Tom. I mean, I think you ought to count yourself as lucky in that case if something that you do in your everyday life has some value in and of itself. I think there are plenty of people who wish that were true and say that that's true, but for whom it is not actually true. It
Mm.
is a sort of a transactional exchange. Somebody wastes your life, and in return, you get some money to kind of deaden the blow a little bit.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think I think it's maybe not as much about the specific role that you're doing as it is the values that you apply when you're doing that role and the sense of meaning that you give to that role. Like it
Mhm.
said, I think it was Dan Pink who wrote that we are meaning making machines, and it's a great use of alliteration. But I think it's true. I think we can attribute meaning to almost anything and define what that thing means to us without having somebody else tell us what it means from the company's point of view, the community's point of view, or the nation's, whatever. Build it up as much as you want. But I think it's an intrinsic thing that is inherent to us. But I think it's very difficult for young people, like you say, when they're in these environments where the game has been set up to such an extent where if we want to call it this, if we talk about what Nietzsche termed the death of God, where we've suppressed these inner yearnings, these more what are called irrational yearnings, when we suppress these things and we've given money the green light and said, yeah, money's good, let's give people affluence, let's give them money, and then they're going to go and create more and they're going to create a better future and we're going to live longer, we're going to be more affluent, and we're going to lift everybody out of poverty. It's very difficult because, like you say, what does that extra money mean to a young person? Now, for me as a young person, I remember when I was a teenager, I'd have snapped your hand off if you'd have given me more money to buy a new bass guitar and an amp or something like that. But beyond that, so what? I wouldn't really have been too bothered.
Right, right. I mean, there's kind of a lower level. I think if you're young and you're able to get those material items that you really want. For me, it was also musical instruments. Um, Beyond that, didn't
Yeah,
care.
yeah,
Didn't care.
exactly.
I think about what you're saying. I don't want to jump ahead too much here, Tom. But so one kind of far right ideologue who I've written about, studied, even taught about in my classes is Alain de Benoit, a
Mm,
French thinker who borrows a lot from Nietzsche as well. And it's no accident that the two sound fairly similar to one another on this point. But it, he has written about, and some others in his sphere have written about what they see as a phenomena of compensations for the loss of sort of community and collective identity in that particular sort of meaning or spiritual meaning. And I love, I'm a college professor, so, and I teach a couple courses where we explore this material. I love talking to my students at the University of Colorado about fraternity life, about Greek life, and is it an accident? You go out of your way to get this new sort of tribal symbolism that you can display in the world. With your Greek letters, it's ancient. It's not something that just popped out of the sky yesterday. It's not something that gains its currency by its future. It's future usage or something like that. It's supposed to be from antiquity in a certain sense. At least that's the mythology around it. And what do you call your community members, your co-community members? You call them brothers and sisters. So you find you use the trappings and the symbolism of tribe and of extended family again, to add some depth and purpose and add context to your life. Those A cynic would look at that situation, as Alain de Benoit has in some cases, and said, uh, is it an accident? Capitalistic society, modernism pulls apart the previous foundation and fabric of collectivity, of community, and then it commodifies these substitutions for it, and it sells them back to you, whether it's the clothing of the fraternity, or gear for your favorite sports team, the Broncos, the Denver Broncos, your favorite clothing brand, or sports outfit or something like that. So you can shuffle around. None of them will actually satisfy the need that they're trying to address, which is so perfect because it means that you will maintain your anxiety and continue to spend and continue to try on different substitutions. None of them will work, but you will create a massive amount of economic activity in the process.
that sounds very, very familiar. It sounds very much like English football. I'm a big Leeds United fan, for example, in the UK, and Leeds is a club that is the ground is based in an area of high economic deprivation. And I actually lived near the ground just after I finished university, when I was in my first job post graduation of my master's degree. And I was living fairly near the ground at the time. And you would walk around and you would get a sense that for some people who were plugged into that was it. That club, that community around that club, the stories, the folklore about players, about the anecdotes, the stories of what happened with him and what happened in this interaction back in the day, they were part of the law that was being shared between these people. And although they were living in real economic deprivation, that mattered so much to them and their sense of self. And they really felt that. And a lot of people don't understand this, and they can be quite supercilious about it. So it's just men kicking
Yeah.
a pigskin around a field. But it isn't just that to those people, because it's the fabric of the culture. It's what brings them together. What gives them a reason to be in the same place at the same time, much like church would have done back in the day, so to speak. And
Yeah.
these players, and sometimes the coach as well, are like gods. And that's why the name, the player,
Yes.
there's a degree of idolatry in there, if you want to put it like that, where players' names are put on the back of shirts that are then sold, and like you say, the economic activity that ensues with that. And you can see why that's the case, because everywhere else I look in society, especially in the UK, everything is supposedly so rational and everything is supposedly so reasonable, and to the point where I feel, and maybe this isn't true, but because I'm a religious person, for example, I believe in God, I always feel when people don't ask me why I don't drink, for example, at different functions and events, I think, oh, here we go again. Because I know what's going to happen. It's going to be a big, long discussion about why do you believe in God, and why do you believe this, and why do you believe that? And that's actually totally cool, because every conversation I have with somebody, and I'm not going around trying to preach to anybody, but every conversation is entirely different. But the point is that I'm seen as an oddity, because there isn't anything else that is really bringing people together. I think social media has played a role in doing that, around, Facebook and sometimes LinkedIn and Twitter, and there are other communities around that. But there has to be something, like you say, there has to be something that underpins that underlies that's more existential, that the individual can be integrated into, rather than just showing up on a platform per se. And this is where I think we've got the issue with identity politics. And it isn't just the far right, but it's also the far left and other different strands of identity politics, where we have these groups and they want to be, it's like they want a framework to live by. They want a credo, but because everything is so dispersed and fragmented, where do they go for that? How do they create that?
Yes.
And they tend to congregate online, and they have these rules between them, where it's like, well, you don't believe this, you do believe that. And in some cases, I think that they're far more dogmatic than I've ever seen in any religious context.
Yes, and a cynical or a critical analysis of that would say that the very dogmatism of it testifies to the anxiety and the urgency of actually creating something that isn't there. And that, if you're involved in a struggle, if you're straining to make a group and to create a sense of togetherness and commonality, you're probably going to overemphasize certain things like rules, like commonality, for example. And in this conversation, I don't want to lose sight of the fact or imply that I think that we really did move from a past of total order, clarity, wholeness into a present of complete chaos, and in the exact opposite. Of course,
Yeah.
there's one of the culprits in all this is the actual narrativizing, the narrative of loss, and that particular claim, which might be creating some anxiety in and of itself. But I also don't think that it's completely false. I think that all these forces are combining in a way. But what is, I mean, you mentioned that you're religious, Tom. If this is an additional outgrowth, not so much of migration, or the growth, urbanization, the movements of peoples, or the growth of mass societies with massive nation states and things, but if it is the gradual decline of religion in public life. To give a quick anecdote on another aspect of this, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I've been very interested in the phenomenon of public statements in American society, and the fact that people are looking to universities like my own, for example, for a public statement of condemnation against Russia, and that's certainly an expectation that the university itself has sown, because it started making public statements about George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and things of that nature. When it came to Ukraine, my university said that they were not going to be doing that because it really goes against their constitution. They're not about they're not necessarily moral leaders. You shouldn't look for moral clarity to them, because the university is really a place of discussion. It's a place of conversation and different voices and collaborations that need to be preserved. That's really what they're about, as opposed to other institutions, some other institution in society that would be a moral leader.
Yeah.
And which no one quite wants to say, but the only suitable one would seem to be either the state. And most people do not look to the state for moral leadership, or the government, because it's such a partisan, highly contentious set of individuals and institution. So the other would be a religious institution, but we don't have a religious institution that functions that way, regardless of what churches want to do in society. So all that is to say that the kind of the place or non-place of religion in our society, it keeps coming up for me.
Yes, it does for me as well, and it's interesting reading Carl Jung's work. I was gripped by one of his later works. I think it was one of the last books that he wrote, not the very last book, but one of the last books that he wrote, The Undiscovered Self. And it's, goodness me, if you read it now, it would be more alarming than than when I previously read it a few years ago, because he talks about visions that he had of nuclear war and the end of mankind. So it's not bedtime reading. Although when I was reading it, I was so gripped by it. I was reading it at 3 a.m. on a Friday night and that sort of thing, because I was absolutely wrapped with what he was saying. Because what he was saying was this idea of, he was very critical of Nietzsche. He thought that Nietzsche was brilliant, but he was also very critical of Nietzsche, because he believed that Nietzsche had kind of missed the point on God. I mean, Jung himself was asked in a BBC interview just before he died, do you believe in God? He said, no, I don't. I know that God exists. So he was pretty certain in himself that God existed beyond the point of belief. But in this particular book, he writes about how the state has supplanted God altogether. And so this has sown the seeds. Now you think about when did he write? It was like in the middle of the 20th century, so the 50s or the 60s, I think in the 50s, if I'm not mistaken. Mm. And he's talking about how the groundwork has been laid for the demagogue. The groundwork has been laid for the demagogue because of the proverbial death of God, because it has created a vacuum. It's created a huge vacuum. Even Nietzsche himself acknowledged that when he wrote, I think it was in The Twilight of the Idols, he wrote about the effectiveness of Christianity in terms of its integratedness, the integratedness of its institutions, but also the integratedness of its values. And because of that, he said, look, the English might not be actually that religious per se, even in late 19th century, but they are behaving in a religious ways, according to religious values, without even knowing it, because Christianity is so effective and it's so integrated, again, in its values and institutions. And there's this really interesting phrase that he uses. He says, for the Englishman, morality is not yet a problem. And I think to myself, and that's always stuck me, because I think, well, when is it going to be a problem? When is morality going to be a problem? Because it's a when for me. It's not an if it's going to be a problem. It's a when, because like you say, there is no church, like universal church, to look to for these standards. And right. So where do we get them from?
Right. And it's, I mean, the secular humanist argument against that is of course that, well, the morals come from us. They came from us in the beginning. Religion got its morality from humans and not the other way around. That's a it has been a line of Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. But fine, it still seems to me that society as a whole needs, and in certain moments wants, moral leadership, wants a collective moral leadership and icon, and it's in those moments when we don't really have one, and the idea of a dispersed, sort of egalitarian, non-hierarchical moral leadership suddenly reemerges as a problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we will there too, I think, find compensations for it.
Yes, exactly. And that idea, morality, it seems to be such a dirty word. It seems to be such a dirty word. Like the thought that anybody would make any sort of moral judgment is really scorned at in our societies, and we really don't like the idea. Oh, please don't think I'm making a moral judgment. But actually, I don't think. I think that's kind of disingenuous in a lot of ways, because I think we make moral judgments ourselves all the time about what's right and wrong. We just don't vocalize it because it's not socially acceptable to do so. But of course we're going to make moral judgments about what's right and wrong, because we want to keep ourselves safe, we want to keep our families safe, and we also want good outcomes. We don't want outcomes that are deleterious or subpar.
Right. It's. I mean, that's partially. I mean, the age of relativism, that we don't accept that no one has a right to impose their notion of right and wrong on somebody else. And thus we're in this, what did Strauss call it, an existential state where we've all kind of withdrawn our morality and our commentary to the privacy of the self, radical introspection of the self, as Alexander Dugan would put it.
Yeah.
Positively. So yes, at the same time, it's odd that I think there's more complexity to it than this conversation might imply, though, because we also see a sort of hyper moralism and moralizing in certain questions, and I think that tracks more with power, though, with individuals who do feel, whether it is the right or the left, and I think that's transitioned in the past decades. But if you feel that you have the power to impose a morality, you try to.
Yes.
I think in American society during the Bush years, we saw that the right fancied itself as having the ability to cancel and did it. And regionally, it has the ability to do that in some parts of the United States, and it does it and attempts it. Meanwhile, the left has also a lot of claim over public culture, and will try and impose and manage and police immorality
Mm.
in those domains where it can too. So,
Yeah.
all those ideas are floating around here, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, gosh, we could get down a very deep rabbit hole with this, and I do agree that there are different types of morality in different contexts, but I suppose the language is different, but the effect is the same. So whereas people don't, people are very careful to say I'm not making a moral judgment when in actual fact they are, but it's couched differently. It's even looking at something like wokeism, for example. And like you say, from the left, that's something that comes from the left, but actually it terrifies a lot of people who are not on the right, people who are very sensible, center-minded people. I speak with a lot of academics, and I have conversations with them in private, and a lot of them are actually worried about this. They're scared that they're going to say something that falls foul of this mob-like mentality, and they are going to be cancelled. They're going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their livelihoods. And these concerns have been raised to me from people who I would never expect. They're not even necessarily in the humanities.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, I've heard it from people in the humanities who I happen to know their political values are very much in line with, the wokery, or however, whatever the going term is, right now. And they're still concerned because it's very hard to know where these boundaries go. And they seem to narrow constantly. The consequences for falling outside of them seem to be greater and greater all the time. So, yes, absolutely. I mean, my point is also, though, that everybody cancels. Ross Douthat wrote this in the New York Times, that
Mm,
if we shouldn't treat cancellation as though it is a left-wing phenomena. It appears to us left today because I think the left has had some predominance in cultural conversations in the past years. But
mm,
you look to Florida today. Ask yourself if you've heard of the band the Dixie Chicks. Last time you heard them perform,
mm.
everybody cancels if they have the ability to. It's a battleground.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very good point. Thanks for making that, Ben, because this is really what we're getting into is the fact that these issues are ubiquitous. The battlegrounds, as you call it, the kind of the chaos is ubiquitous. And I think coming back to what you were saying about Alexander Dugan, I think he is actually, from what I understand of his own journey, as you've communicated it in your writing, and on various different podcasts that I've listened to of yours, he very much seems as though he was a product of chaos, a product of a chaotic environment. And he seemed like a very chaotic individual growing up. He was
Mhm.
dressing up in Nazi regalia and drawing on symbology from the Soviet Union as well. So he was all over the place, wasn't he?
Eventually, yes, he was absolutely all over the place. I mean, long, week-long drinking binges that were extreme even by Russian standards. That was part of Alexander Dugin's upbringing, as best as I've understood. I've never actually talked with him about this. This is only just using secondary sources. Our conversations have always been about contemporary issues instead. And yeah, you saw someone who was in the living during the last the dying gasps of the Soviet Union, had some family connections to upper ranks within the Communist Party and the state apparatus, but not much, and wanted a way to rebel, wanted to find places where he could agitate, where he could break out of the mold, and suffered in some ways for it, as did others who had the same sort of desires around him. And uh, what's telling for him, though, is that, I mean, to find chaos, to provoke, to diverge, to access some deeper dissidence involved, yes, Nazi theatrics, I think we should call it. It involved rock music. I think he played guitar in a rock band, and then it also involved alternative spirituality. The logic behind the latter being that, well, the state can access and manage and control and surveil all of my material activities, but they can't actually get in here inside my brain,
Mm,
inside my head, and
mm,
inside my psyche. And so if I invest myself, if I retreat essentially to spirituality, I will be active in a place where I'm also free, in a
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Uh,
Well,
uh,
that reminds me of Viktor Frankl. Sorry, just to interrupt
yes.
on that point, but that
Uh-huh.
reminds me of Viktor Frankl.
Yep.
If you think of man's search for meaning and his experience of the in the concentration camps, and how he makes that very point that the oppressors, the guards in the concentration camps can't access what's going on in anybody's head, and that's how he got through that. But Dugan's using the same approach in relation to a different existential crisis, or almost like a personal. This sounds to me like a struggle of the individual against the state, which is similar to what Jung was talking about.
Yes, yes, it is in a way the best, I think the better parallel, because it's more about a state, an individual state, as opposed to this, that very exceptional situation where you're literally a prisoner in a prison camp. A parallel might be to Ernst Junger's Forest Passage instead, where there also you have a character, a protagonist of sorts, who finds that the outside world, society, is completely, fully hostile to you, prohibits your vision for the future, prohibits your dreams. And granted, in Junger's case, this is a reactionary, ultra conservative vision, we'd have to expect in some ways. And what do you do in that situation? And for Junger, it was both a retreat, into the recesses of the psyche, into spirituality. It was also access with nature, something that transcends society and culture, and thereby, it puts you in contact with something greater. Um, and at the same time, then it was also the production of an outward existential, exoteric, excuse me, exoteric life and life way that would, at face value, conform to society's expectations, but perhaps even do so to such an extent that it starts to undermine society, to the extent that you might even remove all traces of dissidency in society, and thereby create a great deal of nervousness on part of the authorities. That's what Junger was talking about, but it
Mm,
was. I see a bit of that in Dugan, because there's activity on both fronts, even though
yeah.
his was not just to necessarily to conform,
Mm.
uh, exoterically.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So all this then to bring us back to your Swedish yearnings, your Swedish plight. You wrote something quite interesting in the introduction to your book, Lions of the North, which really does dig into Swedish nationalism, and you're very particular in that to break down the three types of Swedish nationalism. But one thing that particularly stood out to me was how you seemed, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you seemed to have some difficulty in connecting with Swedish patriotism. And what I've inferred from your writing is that there had been this drive towards multiculturalism, towards liberal democracy, and a replacing of romantic nationalism and religion with rationalistic liberal values instead. And so, as I read it, it seemed to me like the only place that you really found any talk of or promotion of Swedish patriotism was amongst the nationalists. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. It's somewhat unfortunate, somewhat tragic for me. This if you think back to the teenager in suburban Colorado, okay, I want to find my place in the world, and so I research my genealogy, and it's Swedish, and I go off to
Mm,
Sweden, and Sweden is this exceptional country. It's such a strange country. Westerners think, Americans go to Sweden and they think, oh, it's like us. It's not. It's a very, very bizarre, exotic society. And it was exotic in its hostility to the very type of conception, the very conceptual framework that had made it attractive to me. The notion that that Swedes would be united, that they would be united by their history in some sense, and that it could be inherited, that ethnic Swedish identity was a thing, and potentially a good thing. Um, those points are all negated in large sectors of Swedish society, and so I got there, came to a Sweden that, compared to Germany, displays flags slightly more often in public, which is not saying much. But aside from that, adopts a similar sort of German individualism slash internationalism, that, national identity, ethnic identity, spiritual community, tradition are all they're all superstitions that need to be overcome in order to get to where they want to be. The actual deep Swedish nationalism, which is an anti-nationalism, which is a transcendent modernism, understood if there's anything Swedish about it, it is only that they do it better than everyone else. It's that they are even more detached from their nationality than others who haven't quite come as far as they have.
Right, right.
Uh,
So that is a liberal ideal, isn't it? That ideal that we are advanced, we are progressed, we do not believe in anything metaphysical because it's irrational. So we jettison it, we throw it out, and we move beyond it to progress. Is that
Absolutely.
fair
I
to
mean,
say?
the only metaphysics might be equality,
Sure.
um, and that's very unstated. But it takes over everything, and it's people think of Sweden as being a socialistic society. That's very common to hear in the United States. Sex, suicide, and socialism was this adage about Sweden in the 1950s and 60s. But it's actually a very individualistic society. That the role of the state is to free the individual from dependency on their fellow community members and family members. That's what the welfare state is really for. That's the actual end goal of it in a lot of cases, is a greater individuality and independence from the people around you. So it's made that way. There I was doing family research, wanting to connect with people. The bonds between us, my bond to the land, to the people, was ethnic. Almost not to want to sound like I'm speaking in euphemisms. I almost want to force myself to say racial, because that, in some ways, that's what I'm actually referring to, even though it feels
Mm,
very, very unsettling to put it in those terms.
mm,
And so there I am in this place that's very hostile to the idea, and there's one class of people in Sweden who do observe that way of thinking that I'd come there with, and it's the right wing extreme, the far right, in most cases. Occasionally older generations of Swedes wouldn't be thinking in those terms, but that I wrote in my book about how that made for a really arresting situation too for me, that I a paralyzing situation, because I liked all of this kind of extra political kind of cultural instincts, and even as a young teenage boy, a sort of fierceness from the nationalists, at the same time as whatever I might have felt towards them. I'm politically left leaning. I'm certainly turned off by, frightened, disgusted by a lot of the actual particulars of the politics there. It's not as though I would ever align with their political cause in any meaningful sense. And so it became this attraction, disgust, sympathy, fear complex toward those actors, which is hard to write about. There have been some hostile readers of that section of text that we're discussing in this book who just read that and they took out all the politics and just said, Ben Teitelbaum liked the far right extremists in
mm.
Sweden. Period. We'll
Yeah.
and this is it. But it was those details were indispensable to to my experience then, and also into the way that I was going to relate to these people going down the road.
Yeah, and that I was gonna talk to you about that, because I feel as though when I read that introduction in Lines of the North, I thought, wow, this is seriously honest. There's some serious intellectual honesty and integrity here, and people talk about that. They pay lip service to intellectual honesty, but what you wrote in that introduction, I thought, wow, this is somebody who is really telling the truth in in a way that could have caused you a lot of problems. I think in the world that we live in today. Did you get a lot of flack for it from people
Oh
professionally, or?
yeah, so much so that I'm very grateful that you say that to me, Tom, because yeah, you get a lot of crap. I mean, it's I've had the most famous anthropologist in the world living today, the most cited anthropologist alive, Nancy Shepherd Hughes, a wonderful scholar, but gave a paper at the largest anthropology conference in the world, not about my work, I would say, but about me. And the primary source material were these pages in my first book, Lines of the North, read, with blackout marker in hand. We're going to take all the pieces of this that support the notion that we have a bad actor, a seriously bad actor in our academic field who needs to be called out, and we're going to erase everything that does not support that. And what you end up with, yeah, is something that sounds pretty damning if you do that.
Wow. Wow.
You could put together without, by omission, by misreading, but not by false quotation. You could put together a pretty damning sounding text about me, and it always leaves me in the position of struggling in technicalities, a very weak position to argue back, to point out that they're wrong. So yeah, it's something that you have to count on. I've still been surprised that some readers have been as motivated to malread as they have been.
Yeah, and it is a mal reading. I would say it's definitely a mal reading because I didn't read from it that you were a far right activist or sympathetic to the far right causes, more the people. And this is an excerpt that I would love to read from that introduction where you talk about this, which it reads: nationalists are people to me rather than ideologies, and I cannot write about them in the demonizing language demanded by activist audiences or with the unbiased remove I might once have coveted. That is really powerful to me because you're talking about the individual, you're talking about the person. Goodness me, does the world not need that more than ever? The ability to see people instead of ideologies, instead of labels. I think that should be celebrated. I think that people should be going to academic conferences, doing papers on just that sentence and figuring out how we can do this more effectively so that we can dig into what's going on with not just the far right, but also the far left and other elements as well, and figure out what is happening with these people, what is motivating them, what is behind this. Because like you said, you're not motivated by the cause of the far right or some of the abhorrent things that are part and parcel of it, but there are some things at an existential level that they are talking about that liberal society has decided to throw away, that has decided has no value because it's not rational or it isn't economically prosperous or giving prosperity. So
Right.
what do you make of that?
Well, it's like if what's demanded. I mean, the voice that I'm arguing against when I wrote those words is one that says, okay, these people are so horrible. We're beyond the stage of consideration. When you say you want to understand them, what you're talking about is relativizing them. You're implying that all of our disagreements in the world are just a matter of misunderstanding. Right, and if we just get together and have our kumbaya moment, everything is going to be fine. There are no actual oppositions in social life. Um, my response is actually not a direct confrontation with that, but it's more that I see a bunch of dangers from gratuitous and careless labeling of people, and I see virtually no benefit to it either. The calculus, the equation gets very, very simple to me. I say, okay, well, if I just want to call these people fascists, um, on the one hand, they're never going to live up to some of the media characterizations about them. I've never met a human being. I don't preclude the possibility that such a person could exist, but I've never met a human being who is thoroughly stupid, ugly, hateful, dangerous, wrong, just completely all the time. And they would have to be that way in order to justify the characterizations that we get of them in media. So that's a problem right there. Is that
Mm,
we're trafficking in a sort of falsehood when we work in these absolutes. It's an anti-intellectualism. No one wants to say that, even though I think they actually do mean that.
mm,
If when you talk to them about the risks of learning, um, and so there's danger there. And then I don't think. On the other hand, like if I were to call, so there are dangers, are there benefits to it? There are drawbacks, but what are the benefits to calling people just ideologies, treating them like cartoon characters? Um, uh, are we establishing boundaries for conversation and discourse? No, we're not. I'm
mm,
not. It goes back to this question of moral authority. I
mm,
don't think that there's a meaningful population out in the world that looks at, let's say, swastika clad, uh, rioters in cities and says, "Well, I'm not sure what I want to call them. I'm
Yeah.
going to wait until an academic from an American university tells me what to do, and then
Yeah.
I'll adjust my behavior accordingly." No one, that person does not exist.
Mm,
If they do, they're not agents of history.
mm, mm.
Um, so it becomes a silly game with, to me, for no benefits, and then a lot of intellectual drawbacks. And yeah, I appreciate that, Tom. I think that more people think this way than will admit it.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. So let's dig into that a little bit more then, Ben. What is the draw towards nationalism? Why are people attracted to nationalism in terms of the people that you studied and that you spoke to? And when I say nationalism, I'm including the far right in that as well, of course.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that you can look at racism, um, xenophobia, sexism in some cases as being very unhealthy and supremely destructive responses to something that I think a lot of people can identify with. And this is where kind of my story, I at least have some inroads to empathy in some ways, in some fashions. And it is a meaninglessness, it's a purposelessness, it is a lack of investment in these narratives about how you should find purpose in your life, in this world. To give an example, I I talked to I spent a lot of time in that book actually, talking to nationalists who were really trying to learn and perform Swedish folk music and really kind of study Swedish folk culture, and talked to them about this paradox that they were really interested in. They saw political points to be gained from engaging with folk music. Meanwhile, the primary practitioners of this music, professional folk musicians, the community who go to festivals, like, hate the far right. They're the exact demographic opposite of them, in so many fashions. And I was talking to a nationalist about that, and he said, "Well, yeah, but a lot of these people they themselves are pretty secure in their life." Part of that actually was economic security, I should add, but also, they assumed that they had a certain amount of social stability that the average far rightist did not. This is a very earnest accounting of the situation on part of this activist, who said that, look at the far right; these are damaged people, in a state of disarray, who do not have that security, do not have that confidence that they could, early in their life, forget about a career that would pay them well and instead focus on tie dyeing or something like that, or folk music. It suggested that, these people on the far right had a need for something that the others could mock and make fun of, because they might have not had the same insecurities. And I think that need is what we've been talking about
Yeah.
today. It's there, and it's terrible when that manifests in hostility to other people.
Mm.
But I don't think I think we're selling ourselves short and doing ourselves and those people also a disservice if you don't look a little bit more holistically at
Yeah.
what's going
Absolutely. And just to talk about principles in this context, Ben, and particularly in terms of one of the things that religion really helps with, I believe, is teaching good principles, solid principles. And one of those principles is it has a very, very bad reputation. The brand of it has been seriously damaged, but that is repentance. The idea of being able to change, to transform. And if we don't have anything that teaches us that that is possible, then we might as well throw people in the bin. We might as well say, oh, well, they're far right, they're far left, they're this, they're that, and the other. And then we throw them all together because we don't believe that change, that transformation is possible. And how on earth are they going to believe if nobody else believes that they can change themselves?
right. It's odd, because I think we all know that that's true. If we didn't have some principle in our social behavior that allowed for transformation and allowed for redemption, you and I would not be speaking right now, Tom. Forget about the technology and everything, and the relative peace in the two places where we're sitting. I don't think that language would exist.
Mm,
I don't think we would have words to say to one another. It's so
mm,
fundamental that we have to be able to do something. like this. That doesn't mean that it is without criteria, or that uh, it's completely unqualified. Of course it is, but we have to be able to do that. And in the case of the far right, another thing that jumps out at me that makes it hard for me to condemn someone fully and forever, is that you see a great deal of hypocrisy among the insiders in this, which is not specific to them, by the way. They're hypocrites like you and I and everybody else I know. But there are people on the far right who have, deeply affectionate relationships with their racial or ethnic or cultural others. There are people who have stood up for even hid refugees, living in parts of Europe, who in their then go out in their day-to-day lives and do something quite different. I'm reading a book right now about Tage Lindbom, an ultra-conservative philosopher in Sweden, hated progress, hated feminism, and yet we start to learn that when the doors closed, when he was with his family in private, something totally different came out. So what am I supposed to take someone like that? What am I supposed to say? Am I supposed to? It's almost as if I'm giving them too much credit by treating their public persona as definitive.
Yeah.
Someone says they're a neo-Nazi, but they're hiding refugees
Mm,
from Ethiopia in their basement in Germany. Do I have to believe that they're a neo-Nazi?
mm.
Um, this is it, it's a phony world that we live in sometimes with these designations.
Yes, it is. And it reminds me, just this conversation reminds me, again, going back to the football. I was at a football match a couple of years ago with my dad, and we were sitting in a different stand to the usual place that we sit, and he'd gone off to the gents and he got lost a little bit. But I was sitting next to this guy, and he was a really animated, excited guy, and he had his tattoos all over him, and he had a tattoo of the cross of St. George, the English flag, on his leg. And he started going off on a rant, a bit of a xenophobic rant. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And so rather than tell him to get lost or be quiet or just totally ignore him, I engaged him in conversation, and he made some sort of religious reference. And I spoke to him about how, goodness knows how we got onto this. I can't even remember how. I don't think it's really important, but I quoted a scripture to him, and I said that basically something about unity and something about how Christ died for all of us. And I said, greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. And I'll never forget, he grabbed hold of me in like an embrace, and he said, where have you been all my life?
Uh-huh.
And
Right.
I was really
Probably a
taken
very
aback.
unusual conversation to have, to
Yeah,
not just meet someone with hostility.
yeah,
Not say that
precisely.
I'm gonna make a name for myself. I'm gonna clear my identity by beating you down and
Yeah,
telling
and
you
and
why you're wrong.
and I just thought, yeah, we're all in this stadium, but we're all together. And that was the analogy that I used, saying we're all together. But you're talking about this being a Christian country. What does that mean? It
Uh,
means for everybody. It's inclusive. And so I'm not telling that you're wrong. I'm just giving you maybe a
right.
different slant on it, a different interpretation. Final question, then, Ben. In terms of looking at this, is there a way that we can look at solutions to this? In terms of, we're talking about this purposelessness, we're talking about the difficulties that we have in liberal Western societies that seem to have rationalism, rationality, and money as very high values, but they don't seem to deal with our existential, our more irrational needs. What do you think some of the solutions are to these issues that we're facing?
I don't have a great number of them, but the one thing that I think would help is localism. I think more trying to shrink the scope of our social lives a little bit. Not that there aren't bad things about that, and um, but I think that we can regain something of that if we stay local. I'm slightly culturally conservative in one sense as well, in that um, I would like I hope that my kids do not move that far from me.
Mm,
I would like people to stay closer together. That's not possible for everyone around the world in all ways at all times, but where it is possible, um, I like a bit more of that. I don't like this massive spreading out. I think we end up fooling ourselves into thinking that we can have a sort of global community, that we can't, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that. So those are my, some things that I've said to myself, but they're not great solutions. But it's something.
Very interesting, Ben, and something that maybe you and Alexander Dugan might agree on potentially in terms of
Potentially.
staying close to your roots to some degree. But
Yeah.
this has been a fascinating conversation. There's a massive list of things that I could have talked to you about. I could talk to you all day and all night. We
Likewise,
don't have the time. we don't have the time, but who knows? Maybe we'll make it a third time at some point in the future. But for now,
It's a
thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Yep, these are some of my favorite conversations, Tom. So I appreciate that.
Cheers, Ben.
Cheers.